My fiancé wanted an open relationship right before our marriage, so I canceled the wedding. Part 2. Quick reminder, this is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, watch it first for full context. It's linked in the description. Now, let's dive back in. Update. It's been nearly 5 weeks since I left that therapy room and walked away from what I thought was going to be my forever. I hadn't expected peace to come so gradually, like the tide smoothing over sharp rocks. But with every quiet morning and every decision I made for myself, that peace solidified into something unshakable. And then she showed up. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those slow, gray days when time seems to move differently. I had just come back from the farmer's market with a bag full of vegetables I didn't know how to cook, and I was halfway through a YouTube recipe when someone knocked on the door. I opened it without checking, and there she was. Mela looked smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. Her confidence was gone, replaced by the jittery energy of someone who had nothing left to rehearse. She stood on my doorstep, clutching a paper bag, and said it was muffins. Said she made them herself. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and suddenly she was in front of me offering carbs and regret. I didn't invite her in. Instead, I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We sat on the porch steps like strangers. She started talking fast. Apologies layered between excuses, blame lightly coated with remorse. She said the therapist pushed her into the idea of an open relationship, that she had been scared, overwhelmed, confused. I listened. I didn't interrupt. But the longer she spoke, the more distant I felt. Her words weren't revelations. They were revisions. She said she wanted to start over. That she missed the comfort, the simplicity, the way I made her feel safe. That she didn't find what she was looking for out there. I waited until she finished. Then I told her the truth. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't hate her. But I didn't trust her. And I didn't need to go back to something that had already proven it couldn't hold me. Her face crumpled. She didn't argue. She just nodded. Before she left, she handed me the bag of muffins. I took it not out of sentimentality, but because it felt like the right kind of closure. A gesture, small and harmless, marking the end. After she left, I tossed the muffins in the trash. Not out of spite, but because they weren't part of the life I was building anymore. That night, I opened my journal and wrote the words I hadn't dared say out loud yet. She came back. But I didn't. And just like that, another chapter closed, clean, quiet, and on my terms. A week after Mela's visit, the air around me felt clearer, like even the remnants of her presence had finally drifted away. My days became measured and deliberate. I started running every morning, just a few blocks at first, then longer. The rhythm of my feet on pavement became a meditation, a way to remind myself I was moving, literally and emotionally. The journal I kept had filled pages. It held every thought I hadn't spoken aloud, every line of clarity that replaced confusion. And somewhere in those lines, I started writing something different. Not just reflections, but plans. It began with a rough outline for a podcast. Stories like mine, like so many others, about love twisted by selfishness, about people who walked away from one-sided compromise and found something better on the other side. I didn't want it to be about bitterness. I wanted it to be about rebuilding. I reached out to a couple of old friends, people I had unintentionally pushed away during the relationship. One of them, Kayla, had gone through something eerily similar. We met for coffee, and it was like finding a mirror with scars that matched. We talked for 3 hours straight. About boundaries, about survival, about reclaiming identity. That conversation became my first unofficial interview. At work, I was more focused than I'd been in years. Projects I used to dread felt purposeful. I wasn't waiting on texts. I wasn't checking her profile. I wasn't wondering if the silence would break. Because now, the silence wasn't absence, it was peace. Then another message arrived. This time from someone I didn't expect, Mela's mother. It was short. Respectful. She said she was sorry for what had happened. That she hadn't raised her daughter to act the way she did. That I had been good to her and she had seen it. I sat with that message for a while, unsure how to feel. It didn't change anything. But it meant something. Someone had seen the truth, even if it wasn't the person I'd once planned to marry. I responded with a simple thank you. Later that evening, I published the first episode of the podcast. It wasn't polished, but it was raw and honest. I shared it quietly, not thinking much would come of it. But within a day, messages started rolling in. Listeners who had been through their own betrayals. People who said, "This made me feel less alone." That was all I needed to keep going. The momentum surprised me. With each new episode, more stories poured in, people from around the world who had dealt with partners like Mela, people who had been silenced or shamed for choosing self-respect over comfort. I started outlining a broader series, one that could grow into something real, something impactful. And just as I was preparing a special episode about closure, something unexpected happened. I received an email. Not from Mela. From someone connected to her, though it wasn't clear who at first. The subject line just read, "You should know." What followed was a screenshot. A private thread from a group chat between Mela and a few of our former mutual friends. And what I saw in it made my stomach tighten. She wasn't done. Apparently, she had started spinning a new story, one where I had abandoned her, where I had manipulated the therapist visit, where she was the one blindsided. There was even a mention of me exploiting her for content on my podcast. I knew it wasn't true. But it was a reminder, some people don't walk away clean, they try to smear the floor behind them. The group chat screenshots stuck with me not because I feared what they said, but because of how desperate they read. Fabricated timelines, cherry-picked moments, full-blown revisions of our story. She turned our breakup into a fable where she was the victim of manipulation, painted me as controlling, cold, and even exploitative. What struck me most wasn't the lies, it was the effort. It takes energy to rewrite history. But the truth? It just stands there. Solid. Quiet. I didn't respond. To her. To the people in that chat. I didn't even address it on the podcast. Instead, I doubled down on what was real. The next episode one released wasn't about her. It was about gaslighting, how it warps our memory, corrodes our confidence. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. The messages I received afterward spoke volumes. This is my story. I didn't realize how much I'd normalized this. You helped me put language to what I lived. That's when I knew the podcast had become more than a personal project. It had become a signal in the dark for people trying to claw their way out of confusion. Work continued to pick up. I was invited onto a small panel for a local radio show. They wanted to talk about resilience, recovering from relational trauma, and how stories can be used to reclaim power. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Meanwhile, whispers of Mela's version of the story continued to circle back to me. Not frequently, but just enough to remind me she hadn't let go. One friend told me she tried to start her blog about conscious uncoupling. Another mentioned she was warning people about narcissistic exes. I laughed when I heard that one. Not because it hurt, but because it could no longer. See, there's a moment quiet and unceremonious when you realize their voice doesn't carry anymore. Not in your head. Not in your space. They become background noise in a life that's grown too full to make room for distortion. I was planning a new season of the podcast now. I'd hired a freelance editor. Booked a co-working space. I even started outlining a book, something more structured, something permanent. And that's when the final message came. Not from Mela. From someone else in that group chat, the same one who had sent the original screenshot. They told me Mela had seen my growth, seen the show take off, seen the support, and that it had broken her. That she had tried to imitate it, but it hadn't worked. The message ended with this: she said you became everything she wanted you to be, but for everyone else. I sat with that. Then I closed my laptop, stepped outside, and breathed in the crisp, early evening air. She was right. I did become everything she wanted me to be. Just not for her. And now I wasn't performing for anyone. I was just living it. Update. It's been 6 months since the therapy session that fractured everything, and even longer since Mela first floated the idea of opening our relationship on her terms for her freedom. Looking back, I don't see a betrayal. I see an unveiling. A painful, necessary crack in the mirror that helped me finally see myself clearly. I used to think closure would come from a conversation. A mutual understanding. A reckoning. But it came slowly, like water carving stone, through time, through silence, through truth that didn't need defending. The podcast is now in its 2nd season. It's grown into something I never expected, a small but loyal audience, a community of listeners who've turned their hurt into healing. The messages keep coming. Stories from strangers. Gratitude from people who finally feel seen. It's not about revenge anymore, it's about resonance. I finished the outline for the book. I titled it What I Kept When I Walked Away. This half-memoir, half-guide, about how to rebuild from gaslight and grief, from erasure and expectation. My editor says it's raw, vulnerable, and oddly empowering. That's exactly what I hoped for. Mela hasn't tried to contact me again. Last I heard, she shut down her blog. A few mutuals quietly unfollowed her. One even reached out and said, I didn't see it at the time, but I do now. That was all I needed. See, the final chapter of a story like this doesn't need drama. It doesn't need a grand finale. Just clarity. Just peace. I moved into a new place last month. Bright kitchen. Big windows. No echoes of past arguments. I decorated it slowly, plants, art I actually like. Furniture that fits me. There's a corkboard above my desk now, filled with listener notes, handwritten quotes, and one small card from Kayla that reads, You didn't just survive, you translated it. Some nights, I sit by the window and re-listen to the recording from that therapy session. Not to dwell, not to hate, but to remember, to honor the version of me who sat in that room, heartbroken but mouth shut, gathering strength in silence. That version of me deserved the life I have now. So if anyone ever asks what happened to the man who almost got married, who almost compromised everything for someone who only wanted half of him, I'll tell them this: he didn't just walk away. He walked into something far better. In my opinion, this story is the perfect example of how people will reveal themselves when they think they've cornered you. Her mistake wasn't just wanting something different. It was expecting him to accept less than he deserved. But instead of clapping back, he just walked forward and built something real. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger. It's building the life they never believed they could. If your partner pulled something like this right before your wedding, how would you react? Have you ever walked away from someone who only wanted half of you? Drop your experience in the comments, we want to hear it. Hope you enjoyed this story as much as I do. Help this small channel grow by hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. Every bit of support means the world. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.